You're listening to Inside iOS Dev, show about real-world iOS development. Today with you, your hosts Alex Bush.
And Andrew Rohn.
And today we have a special guest, Soroush.
Hi, how's it going, guys?
Doing good. Glad to have you.
Nice, glad to be here.
So Soroush, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh boy, I am an iOS developer. I'm a contractor. I'm based out of New York City. And if anybody knows me from anything, it's probably my blog, which is at mylastname.com. So Khanlou.com. And then I also do a podcast with Chris Zombach, also about iOS development called Fatal Error.
I like that podcast. I listened to that. It's well recommended, by the way, to anyone listening to this.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and again, Soroush, thanks for joining us today. I think what we're gonna do is kind of have a interview pop style conversation with you about, I guess, iOS architectures, iOS things in general.
We want to pick your brain.
Great. Let's do it.
So, like you said, when you introed yourself, probably most people know you from your kind of public appearance. So I guess starting off, I wanted to kind of find out how and why did you start getting involved in the iOS community?
Yeah. How did I get involved in the iOS community? I guess I always felt like I had a lot to say and I didn't really have somewhere to say it. Kind of early on, I had talked to a couple of other devs and a couple of other people about maybe writing for their sites. And after a couple of rejections, nobody really knew who I was. Nobody really wanted to like have this random person write on their blog or in their magazine or whatever. I was like, all right, well, if I've got to do it myself, I've got to do it myself. And I always looked up to people who had blogs, especially in those early days of like sort of, the indie Mac community before the iOS community was even a thing, like Brent Simmons and John Gruber was never a developer, but like I always thought it was so cool that he was like, writing on his own site. And I was always so into that. And I just started my site. I actually had a false start. I've never told the story publicly. I don't think anybody's ever read these blog posts, but I used to have a small, consultancy isn't even the right word, but it was just like the website that I used for my I would do web design for people, and it was the website for that. And I had a blog on there, and I put a couple of blog posts, and I forget what they were. Nobody ever read them. Nobody knew they were there, and the site's gone now. And they were mostly about sort of web stuff and like how to make. I don't know. There was HTML and JS and that kind of thing, and nobody ever read those, and so that was kind of my false start. And then like I started the blog with my own name in 2012, and then just sort of started posting things when I thought they needed to, like things that I thought needed to be said within the community, things that I thought would be a good thing to sort of put out there. And that's kind of what got me started. And then so I started the blog in 2012, and I always sort of like wanted to get into the speaking circuit as well. And I did a little bit of that between 2012 and 2015 or so the first 3 years. But that stuff didn't really take off until around 2015. So I didn't really speak at many conferences before then. The nice thing about having your own blog is there's no gatekeeper. There's no conference organizer that says like, oh, you have to prove to me that you're going to give a great talk. You could just, write whatever blog post you want, and nobody can stop you from publishing it.
Right, self-publish.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I think we're kind of we had a similar origin story for us. Me and Alex were kind of frustrated with some of the iOS podcasts out there, and our segment that we were kind of specifically targeting was like technical talks. 20 minutes or less you can listen to on your commute, and like you said, no gatekeeper. So I can relate with that.
Yeah, whoever wants to listen can listen, and if it's good, it will rise to the top.
Yeah, exactly.
So
that's the dream.
So yeah, me and Alex, I think Alex maybe more had some frustration with the iOS community. I think because he came from the Rails community. Alex, you might want to talk about it.
Yeah, for me, I guess I kind originally started out as a Rails dev and then switched to Android iOS development and ultimately iOS mostly. And I've seen how different is the Rails community, or rather Ruby and Rails community, compared to every other I've known. And it's a lot to unpack there. I guess I won't go too deep, but I felt like iOS community is less open, less supportive, and they strive to find good solutions less, at least used to. So that's kind of how I start to publish things, right? And the reason why I started to do that. And now we're here, right?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I think the Rails community is like kind of the shining star of developer communities, and everybody is nice because Matt's is nice, and you know, and you read through, and they like really hash out and talk through issues that Rails as a framework is having through their blogs, and you can actually go up and dig up the posts that sort of, you could see them going through the same struggles that we go through, right? So they had their fat controllers first and then skinny models. And then they're like, well, no, let's maybe do skinny controllers and then fat models. And they were like, well, actually, this fat model thing is also kind of untestable. Let's now go to these like policy objects and service objects and interactors. And you can kind of like watch the development of that, kind of in real time through these blog posts. And that like history stays up for a very long time. So I really feel you that like the Rails community is kind of a model for what I want every developer community to look like.
Right. Yeah. And then kind of, I guess, heroes of that community would be people like Sandy Matz, right? Who then just talk about this whole objective oriented approach and more abstract way of thinking about problems. And yeah, it's just, it's a lot. And again, exactly what you said. I wish iOS community had more of that.
Yeah, it's definitely it's definitely changed in the last few years, the iOS development community. I think we've attracted developers from other communities, as well as kind of picked up the ball ourselves on this. Where before, I think a lot of people got into it because they wanted to make the app that you touch beautiful and perfect and amazing. But now there are people that not only want to make the app that you touch beautiful, but also the code that underlies it. They want to make that beautiful because they know that they have to work with this code for 2, 3, 5, 6 years. And they know that like if they make the code nice to work with, then they will enjoy working in it better. And they recognize that like the code that we write has a direct impact on the work that we do. And I think we've gotten a lot better about that in the last 3, 4 years.
Yeah, definitely.
For sure.
Speaking about community, one controversial topic in the iOS community is architecture. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, I think there's somewhat of a crisis, and I think we've been getting closer in recent time. But this is a personal interest of mine, and I have many strong opinions about iOS architecture. I guess so. What you were kind of one of the main proponents of the coordinator pattern, and I see that you've pushed that, and a lot of people have picked that up. What was the inspiration behind that, and how has that helped you?
Yeah, so for people listening who like maybe don't know what a coordinator is, it's essentially an object that sort of manages your flow and handles mutation for you to take that code out of your view controllers and to make your view controllers kind of dumber and more reusable, which I think is pretty good. The start of that was I was working at a startup, and we had a code base, and in that code base, you know, we had our app, and then we also had an app extension. It was a Safari extension, I believe, or an Action extension, one of the two. And you would access it via Safari or via any sort of web page. And we needed you to be able to log in this extension. And so when we brought in the login view controllers, because it was all Objective-C back then, so there was not really that much modularization, and everything was implicitly imported, right? Or explicitly imported. And so bringing in the login view controller meant that we had to bring in every view controller that the login view controller touched. We had to bring in the API. Bringing in the API meant we had to bring in a bunch of the models because the models were all sort of mapped through the API. And then we brought in all that stuff. And then we just ended up importing 3/4 of the app into this extension, which just needed to be able to log in. And it made me realize that the way that we write code, our view controllers are not really reusable in any sense because they're so inextricably tied to the rest of the app just because of all the imports and all the things they have to rely on and all the things they're sort of built on top of.
Everything is coupled to everything, right?
Exactly, yeah. And so my thinking there was okay, well, what if I had some other object that could handle the high level logic of this app so that the view controller could then be reusable? Then I'd be able to pull in this view controller and just any associated small objects that it needs to like do its job without having to pull in tons of like other view controllers. Like, why does this view controller through a long dependent chain know about other view controllers? That doesn't really make any sense. And so it was partially it was trying to figure out that problem. I knew that there was something wrong, and it actually took me a long time to figure it out and to like actually put an implementation in place. It took me like maybe the better part of a year. But that was sort of the impetus and the inspiration for like why I started heading in that direction.
Yeah, to me, I honestly think that the view controller is the center of the universe in iOS, and that's problematic because of its tight coupling with the view. And I think if people just recognize that and it's shouted from the mountains, I think people should shout it from the mountains that don't put everything in your view controller. That's my opinion. And I'm writing a somewhat, I would say, very critical writing on that, and I shared it with the people at Reddit that I work with, and I think they think I'm crazy because I have such a like mad fascination with architecture in iOS. So I guess I asked this. Moving on, I asked this question about from Chris Eidoff, Matt Gallagher, and Florian Kugler, I think, because they're writing the new iOS architecture book. I said, can you describe, or if you had to impart on a iOS developer knowledge in 5 words or less about iOS architecture, so 5 words or less, what do you think you would say?
Oof, 5 words. That's putting
we
me on
can
the
come
spot.
back to it if you need some time.
No, I can figure this out on the fly. View, interactor, presenter, entity wrap. No, I'm just kidding. No,
that was nice.
Good one. Yeah.
What I would actually say is, write what you need. Essentially, don't add a presenter if you don't need a presenter. Don't add. I mean, I think Viper is easy to pick on because it's so well broken down into what the responsibilities of the thing are, but not every screen needs all those responsibilities. Some apps, frankly, don't need coordinators. I think a lot of apps don't need view models. If you stick to a pattern too tightly, you're going to end up writing a bunch of stuff that you don't need. And if you just say, I'm going to write what I need when I need it, it does have the problem of relying on sort of your intuitions about the code base and your thoughts, like your critical thinking about the code base. But what it gives you is it gives you the ability to say like, hey, this object isn't really doing much here. Like, let's just get rid of it. Or we actually need an object here, and it's not a view, an entity, or presenter, an interactor, or a router. We need something else. And you can add that without being worried about like, oh, how is this going to fit into our architecture? So my feeling is essentially write what you need. It's tough to impart, several years of experience in terms, and like, I don't know, 10, 12 different code bases worth of experience of iOS architecture in 5 words, but that's where I've landed on these days.
Great. And you have 1 word to spare.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
No, yeah, I was gonna say it makes a lot of sense. It's I guess do what you need in the moment. Don't overcomplicate it.
Yeah, exactly. If you need an interactor, like if you think your app could benefit from interactors, then by all means, like move to an interactor-based architecture. But if you don't need that, then don't do it. If you have an application that's 2 or 3 view controllers that are always presented in the exact same order, it never changes. It's a pretty simple utility application, like um, one of the really simple built-in Apple apps. Maybe you don't need a coordinator. Like maybe you don't need all that overhead. That overhead is designed to build you the flexibility so that you can reuse your view controllers. But if you're not going to be doing that, just leave it.
Cool, thanks. Moving on to the next question. So I want to know, probably maybe within the last year or so, so it's more recent, what is something that you strongly believed, that you're almost certain about, but don't really believe anymore? Or changed your mind about?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I got a lot of strong opinions about iOS stuff. But I'm pretty heavy in the anti-auto layout camp. I don't think auto layout is that valuable. I think that it burdens you with this model of constraints that doesn't really match how people think about layout. And I think that you kind of have to force yourself to get on that train and to like think about things that way. And the benefit 2 or 3 years ago to this was, okay, well, that is tough to express your layout in terms of constraints. But the nice thing that you get is you get to express these layouts in an interface builder. So you have a graphical way of expressing these layouts. And if you don't use interface builder, then like, what's really the point? But more recently, I've kind of been thinking more about that and kind of dialing back my feelings on it and saying, well, auto layout is a pain in the ass, and auto layout does suck in all these ways. And it when it fails so catastrophically. And when when you're writing it, it can have performance ramifications that you don't even consider when you're writing, let's say, frame division layout code or springs and struts. But it is really, really expressive. And what I mean by that is that you can write different things that are really useful in crazy situations. So like you can write code, some languages are left to right, some are right to left, right? So English, of course, is left to right, and like I speak Farsi. Farsi is right to left. If you need your UI to flow right to left and left to right, then you might start thinking about, okay, well, how am I going to implement this in terms of frame math? Like, this is actually pretty complicated. Like, how am I going to flip this orientation of the system? But with auto layout, that actually becomes pretty simple because the system knows how to flip that for you. And so it's like weird things that you can do like that, that make auto layout more valuable than I kind of previously expected. And, like with all Apple things, you kind of have to add a couple helpers here and there, like, pin this view to its super view. So you set one constraint on all 4 corners or all 4 sides. But you have to do that with all Apple code, and it's kind of a pain in the butt, but like you just got to do it. And once you do it, like there are places in which it's super valuable and super useful.
This is very interesting. I kind of, in a way, I had similar turn. I guess thoughts turning other way around, right, on auto layout. I kind of came to the same conclusion lately, that it's I don't want to say necessary evil, but sort of, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean. And part of this was I wrote an Android app, and Android, when you make a new view, you get to decide. You make an XML template for that view, and it's kind of like an IB file, but you edit the XML by hand. And what you do at the top of every file, the root node of that XML, is you decide what kind of layout you want. So one layout is absolute layout, where you just do frame-based math, which is what we have in iOS. One layout is let's say a linear layout, which behaves like a stack view. And there's a bunch of these different layouts. And one of them is constraint layout. And it kind of made me realize there are situations where I would like to pick this constraint layout because it's actually easier to describe my layout in terms of constraints than anything else. And so that kind of made me realize, like, there are some certain cases where this is a good thing.
Great. Okay, moving on to the next question. I wanted to ask, what are maybe the top, let's say, 2 or 3 books that, because on this podcast we try to target like mid-level iOS developers. So like, let's say top 2 or 3 books to a mid-level iOS developer that are trying to reach that next level. What are some books that you would recommend for them?
Books. All right. I got a lot of opinions about books. I wrote a post about books that I think that intro people should read. A lot of them I got from my Rails counterparts at previous startups that I've worked at. So, we're talking about how the Rails community kind of has their stuff together with respect to this. 3 books I would recommend. One, Domain-Driven Design, which is actually on my desk right now. Yeah, so Domain-Driven Design is by Eric Evans, and it like talks about a bunch of patterns of like how to model your domain and your model, such that how to model your model is kind of a goofy turn of phrase, but how to make objects that represent your model in an effective and accurate way. And I think it's a really, really good book. Just read it, stem to stern. Highly recommended. I would also recommend, we mentioned Sandy Metz earlier, I would recommend Pooter, Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby. I think that's a really great book for making you think about how to design with objects. And then the last one I would recommend is I would recommend Patterns of Application Enterprise Architecture, or Patterns of Application Enterprise, whatever it is. That book, we'll put it in the show notes. And that book is, it's sort of actually like a handbook to writing something like Rails. And, it talks about all these different patterns of how to access the database and how to manage flow through stuff. And books like that, drawing from other domains, have really helped me like up my game in terms of like thinking about these different patterns from different areas and sort of fiefdoms of programming that I can draw inspiration from and like bring things to iOS. So for example, coordinators, that is not stolen completely because it's like adapted for iOS, but a lot of the inspiration for that comes from the application controller pattern that's in Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. So highly recommend that book as well. Those are the 3 books I would say are bomb.
Okay, cool. Also, I wanted to know, this is a hypothetical question. If you were to be, they came to you and they said, Soroush, we love your blog so much. We listened to your podcast on Inside iOS Dev, and we realize we want you here at Apple to lead, the iOS division. And you graciously say, okay, what would you change? Let's just say 1 or 2 things that you would change. And it doesn't have to be actually anything to do with code. It could be like maybe WWDC event is different or anything like that. What are 1 or 2 things you would change?
I would change... Right now, my strongest opinions are in Swift and the Swift programming language. So I'm going to stick to that. Although I'm sure there's lots of other things I would love to change about the way Apple works. Cough, code signing, cough. So the things I would change in Swift, number 1 is I would make all sequences multipass. Everybody who knows me knows that I'm obsessed with this. Sequences in Swift right now sometimes can be single pass, and this makes code really awful and hard to work with. And I would make that change. I put a proposal on Swift Evolution. TBD on if it ever gets implemented. I have some support from some high-level people, but also a bunch of people think it's too big of a change to Swift. So that's one. And the other thing I would do is I would love to institute a culture where the code that Apple gives us is, some people call it batteries included, is one way to put it. Like the tools and the nice things that you need to like write good code are just available for you. Andrew and I met at TechieCon in Atlanta, and we talked about, and the talk that I gave there was this talk called You Deserve Nice Things. And it's all about how you should extend the system classes and the classes in Swift, all the types of Swift, to make the code that you write cleaner, better, a little more optimized, and all that. And all those things that I talk about in that talk should just be part of the standard library. It should be part of UIKit. All those stuff should just be built in. It should be really easy to use this stuff. It should, you should be able to type something in autocomplete and get directed towards the right way to write the code. And I really think that that's important. And I think that's something that Apple's not very good at. Of, why did we only get contained string in iOS 8? Like, why did we have to wait until iOS 8, which was like 3 years ago, to get this method contains string?
Oh, yeah.
And the Apple answer is, well, you had range of string, and you can always check that the location of that is not NS not found. But like, it's horrible, and nobody wants to write code like that. And we deserve nice things. And if I could change a big thing in Apple, it would be that those nice things would come by default.
Yeah, I think I told you at TechieCon, I'm definitely I'm kind of similar in nature to you. I add, well, so we still use Objective-C at Reddit. I add little helper categories for everything, and I'm constantly the one, kind of selling my own categories. Like, oh, did you check out this little
Yeah.
helper method
Why
here?
don't you put this in there? It makes code a little bit
Yeah,
more
exactly.
expressive. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Okay, I think we're kind of reaching the end of our time limit here. So I
Cool.
guess we can close out. Was there anything you wanted to mention here at the end? Say,
No. I'm gonna be at WWDC. I won't be at the conference itself, but I will be in San Jose. So if you're a listener to this show, you want to come say hi, find me. There's an app that me and Ashley Nelson Hornstein wrote called Beacon, which will help people like kind of connect with each other and find each other at these crazy events. So if you make a little Beacon event, tag me in it, and I'll say hi. We'll hang out.
great. Thanks so much, Soroush. And I just want to say personally, meeting you at TechieCon, you're a very nice person, very warm. So I really appreciate that on a personal level.
It's very nice of you to
And
say. Thank you.
and then also, I think your content that you write is great. I think me and Alex probably don't 100% agree with everything that you do, but everything that you do say is well reasoned. And I would actually say most of what you say I agree with.
Yeah.
So I also like the content you put out. I'm a big fan of. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks.
Well, thank you for the nice compliments. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Okay. Well, I guess we're going to close up.
Yeah, guys, thanks for listening. You can reach us at Inside iOS Dev
On Twitter.
And yeah, guys, we'll see you next time.
Take care.
Cool. Take care, folks. Bye.
Bye.